Well, good morning. I'm going to start today with the story of the wolf of Gubbio from the Little Flowers of St. Francis. It happened that a large and ferocious wolf was terrorizing the inhabitants of the mountain town of Gubbio. Starving at first, it devoured not only animals, but began to prey on people. Afraid of being devoured, no townsfolk ventured past the city gates. When Francis was visiting Gubbio and saw the suffering of the people, he was moved with compassion and took it upon himself to confront the wolf, though all advised against it. That night, as the townsfolk watched from the safety of the city wall, Francis ventured beyond the gates and into the surrounding forest. Almost immediately, the wolf came charging out of the forest, its teeth bared. But Francis held up his hands in a gesture of peace, making the sign of the cross. At this, the wolf stopped in its tracks and closed its mouth. Invited to come closer, the wolf approached Francis and lay down at his feet. Knowing that the wolf was suffering from hunger, Francis explained to him that he had no right to cause anguish amongst the citizens of the town. Offering to make peace between the predator and the people, Francis sought to have the people feed the wolf every day in exchange for the wolf never again attacking anyone. He said to the wolf, "Brother wolf, wilt thou pledge thy faith that I may trust to this thy promise?" And putting out his hand, he received the pledge of the wolf. For the latter lifted up his paw and placed it familiarly in the hand of St. Francis, giving him his pledge and bowing his head. From that day forward, the wolf appeared in every town, in town every afternoon, stopping at a different house to be fed. The wolf was gentle and the humans courteous. When the wolf finally died of old age, the people of Gubbio grieved, for when they saw him going about so gently amongst them all, he reminded them of the virtue and sanctity of St. Francis. So we are celebrating St. Francis Day today. I have Francis with me. Francis, of course, is the patron saint of animals and of the environment. And we are also observing our last day in this season of creation. We will have the joy at church in person to have a real life wolf with us named Miguan, who's with the Wolf Education Project. And we're remembering today the lessons that St. Francis and the Wolf of Gubbio have for us. If you haven't noticed it, or if you've never been inside St. James, you may not know that we have a stained glass window in the windows closest to the pulpit. There is a depiction of St. Francis, and standing next to him is the Wolf of Gubbio. So I have a wolf joke. This is mostly for kids, but if you're, a kid at heart, you might appreciate it. A wolf joke. What did the wolf say when he sat on sandpaper? Rough. Okay, in the story of Francis and the Wolf of Gubbio, we see that St. Francis approaches the wolf as a brother. Notice him calling him Brother Wolf, and he interacts with this brother wolf as though he were a beloved creature of God, despite the wolf's ferocity. Francis scolds the wolf for terrorizing the town, but he also invites the wolf into a different kind of relationship with the townspeople, one of peace. Francis also engages the people of Gubbio with a sense of their responsibility to care for the starving wolf, moving them from enmity with the wolf to a peaceful and ultimately a mutually blessed relationship. So much so that the wolf is not only taken care of by the people, but the wolf becomes beloved, and they genuinely grieve for the wolf when he dies. And I think any of us who have ever lost a dear or beloved pet, it's a dog or a cat or even a hamster or mouse, we know the grief can be immense because animals can become very much a part of our families. Now, the story of Francis and the Wolf of Gubbio is a wonderful tale, but many people have asked whether there's any truth to the legend. We know it's often the case that saints and holy people are described as having a special relationship with animals. So some have argued that this story is just pure fantasy. But there's actually some interesting historical evidence for this story. You see, tradition has it that the people of Gubbio buried the wolf after it died and then built a church over the burial site and dedicated the church to St. Francis. Interestingly, it turns out that in 1874, the church of St. Francis in Gubbio was being renovated. And as they were renovating the church, they discovered the skeleton of a large wolf underneath the slab of the church wall. So they reburied the wolf back under the church during that renovation. Now, I, for one, prefer to believe, then, that the wolf of Gubbio really existed. Now, regardless, the story of the wolf has some valuable spiritual lessons for us today. It's similar to some of the lessons that our gospel reading touches on. Jesus in there invites us to learn from our animal friends and from nature itself. In the 6th chapter of Matthew, Jesus tells us to look at the birds of the air. This word for look in the Greek means to gaze and ponder. And then he explains that God feeds the birds and cares for them. And just as we see God's love and care for the birds, so we can be assured of God's love and care for us. Then Jesus invites us to consider the lilies. Now again, this word consider in the Greek actually means to study, to examine. So Jesus is directing us to study, to consider the flowers. Emily Dickinson once wrote, "Consider the lilies, the only commandment I ever kept." Clearly, we have something to learn as we observe God's creation, and we're invited to truly pause and to ponder nature in this passage. And I think also of Alice Walker writing in her book, The Color Purple, with this quote, "I think it annoys God if you walk by the color purple in a field somewhere and don't notice it." Then again, Jesus reveals that God clothes those fields with splendor, with these beautiful flowers. And so just as God clothes and cares for the natural world, so we can be assured that God will clothe and tend to us. Creation matters to God, and we matter to God. And so all of it matters. Indeed, these readings invite us into a different and broader way of seeing the natural world of God's creation as more than either something to be used or used up, or even as something to engage as though we were enemies at war, fighting over resources. Now, we might be tempted to think, well, we don't wage war with nature or animals, but of course we do all the time. That's why we have companies that exterminate what we people call nuisance wildlife. It's why we're actively destroying the rainforest and the coral reefs and depleting the fish of our oceans and polluting the environment with the misery of factory farms. Of course, the list goes on. There's many examples. You don't need me to tell you. Just this week, the U.S. declared the extinction of yet another species. This time, it's the ivory-billed woodpecker. Its kind are gone forever. What Jesus and Francis and the wolf invite us to do is to simply broaden our perspective enough to see God's love and care being reflected back to us in nature, in creation itself, with the potential, at least, for greater peace between us. And then we must ask whether there aren't other and better attitudes and solutions than what we're currently doing. Is there a better way? What would it look like if we related to the natural world, to animals and to nature more broadly, not as enemies or merely as resources to be used and consumed, but as brothers and sisters, as part of God's loved and valued treasures on this earth that we must all share? What would it look like to have more mutually beneficial relationships and a sense of greater loving responsibility? How would that benefit not just creation, the land or animals, but ourselves? Today, St. Francis and Jesus invite us to consider to study, to examine, to ponder the lilies, the birds, the forests, the seas, the land, the wolves, and there discover what lessons of love and care God has for us as the people of God in God's creation. Amen.